Chapter 35. Saturday, February 14th, 1778. Bellingham rode his horse alongside the wagon that the guard had dumped me in. I sat next to a cask of flour and a small chest of tea. He spoke. My ears were stopped up with snow and anger and blood. And then we were standing in the front of the back door to Moor Hall. And the horse was gone, the wagon gone. He reached out around me, opened the door. And then I was sitting in a chair before a kitchen hearth. An old cook with twisted fingers set a steaming bowl before me. I picked up the bowl and sipped. My hands were no longer shackled together, but it felt like they were. My feet were dry, but my bones were ice. I drank all the broth. My head laid itself on the table, and I was no longer master of my own body, of my head, of my heart, and somewhere my father was angry, and I did not know how to explain. My eyes closed themselves. I will kill Bellingham. Chapter 36. Saturday, February 14th, 1778. When I spoke, the clouds were scurrying to cover the late afternoon sun. The food and sleep had drained the befuddlement from my head. It hurt some when I stood up, but I could see and think clear. A stocky lad carrying a jar and dirty polishing rag entered the kitchen of Moor Hall. He was taller than me, but not too many years older. His eyes were set far apart from each other and bulged a bit like a frog's. His shoes were polished, both the leather and the fat pewter buckles. Spotless white stockings fit tight to his calves. His breeches were black wool and appeared tailored to his form. He wore a tobacco-colored waistcoat over a linen shirt as white as snow, the sleeves of it rolled up so that he might work without making it dirty. Had his skin been white, I would have figured him for a manservant, working for one of the congressmen. As his skin was dark as mine, it was more likely that he was a slave. "Your master will see you now," he said. The request was not long enough for me to reckon where he came from. New England, the South, the Middle States, or across the ocean. "My name's Curzon," I said. "You?" He moved a wooden box on the shelf to the side. "How did you come to be here?" I asked. He placed the jar on a high shelf. "I was sent to fetch you, not stand about drawing." "Who is your master?" He folded the rag and set it aside the jar. "You'll follow me." He led me to a dining room converted to be a useful place for the men of the Congress. Mirrors were hung opposite the windows to strengthen the last rays of the sun. Dim portraits glared down from the walls, lit by guttering candles and wax-covered sconces. The long table was completely covered with books, half-burned candlesticks, hills of papers, and an enormous map. I could not read the words at the top of the papers, but I recognized numbers, long columns of numbers that were added up to great sums. The room was cold, the fire dying. Bellingham sat at the far end of the table. "Ah," he said, looking up from the papers before him. "Resurrected at last. Fetch some wood for the fire, Gideon. The maid is neglected again." Gideon was this fellow's name. He nodded and gave a courteous "sir" before gliding through the door and closing it behind him without a sound. Bellingham set down his pen and waved me closer. "Let me see what damage that buffoon did to your pate." I walked the length of the table, bent at the waist so he could peer at my head, then stood again. "You'll heal," he said. "It's not deep." I said nothing. He sat back in the chair and sighed. "This is for the best. You'll see that in time." I stared, imagining his wrists in shackles, a noose lowered over his head, kicking away the stool that he stood upon. The sound of the rope would make as it snapped his neck. "We're crowded here, but it's better than the frozen hovel on the hill. You'll have decent clothes and food." He waited for a reply, but still I said nothing. Any words I spoke could surely earn me a fierce beating. I did not yet have control of my mouth or temper. The silence of the room was broken by Gideon, who entered carrying a scant armload of firewood. He deposited it by the hearth and knelt to revive the fire, but Bellingham waved him away. "Leave that," Bellingham said. "Remind the cook that the gentlemen will be hungry when they arrive, and that she ought to heat up some fresh wash water for Curzon, and send the maid in." Gideon stood and inclined his head. "Yes, sir." Bellingham waited until Gideon had again disappeared, then stretched his arms above his head once and yawned. "The maid takes care of the mending and washing and whatever else is needed." My mouth remained locked. I would not be goaded into conversating with him, to act as if all was well and natural. Gideon's on loan to the committee from one of the congressmen in York. He struggled to properly serve the 5 of us. Your help will be most welcome. He'll show you the lay of the house and explain our routines. It'll be much like our time in New York, only with more coats to brush and boots to clean. He speared a cold potato with his fork and bit it. Where's that blasted girl? Will you attend the fire, Curzon? If we wait for her to do it, we'll surely freeze. I crossed to the hearth and picked up the fire poker, a length of iron as thick as 2 fingers and as long as my arm. I could crack his skull with one hard blow. But I was still barefooted and half-starved. Even if I outran the guards, I'd perish of the cold. I had to soldier my temper. For now. I knelt and poked at the dying coals. I function as an aide to the committee from Congress, Bellingham said proudly, as if I'd acquired about his position. It was a stroke of genius to become as close as I did to Morris those last months in New York. You'll remember him. Young chap, flirts shamelessly, rich as Midas. Serve him first, always, then Reed, for he has the ear of General Washington. Then me. The other 2 fellows are good enough, but they can't help my plans. I arranged the wood above the coals in a crisscross fashion. Morris has hinted I might be appointed to head up the commissionary on account of my mercantile experience. At the very least, I ought to become a person of rank within one of the divisions responsible for supplying the army. I need your ears again, Curzon. Listen in on any and all conversations, particularly when Morris and Reed meet with anyone from headquarters. I ignored him and blew on the coals to revive them. A few weeks was all I needed. In that time, I'd learned the habits of the gentleman, who was tidy, who was forgetful, who carried coin upon his person, and who left it in his chamber. I'd eat everything I could to strengthen myself for the escape. When the right moment presented itself, I'd know who to steal from, how, and in which direction to flee. The coals glowed red. There was a quiet knock on the door. Enter, Bellingham said. The door opened. The maid, sir, Gideon announced. Perfect, Bellingham said. That's all, Gideon. I blew again as the maid stepped softly across the floor. I would not alert Gideon to my plan. There was something about his manner I did not trust. Sparks finally popped. Bellingham continued conversating with himself. Morris arranged my position assisting the Congress, he chuckled. Had 2 rooms all to myself near City Tavern, far nicer than this. I bought a sturdy mare for £15, and this girl for 10. The coals burst into flame. Oh, do stand up, Curzon, Bellingham said. I can hardly introduce her to your backside, can I? I stood, brushing the ashes and wood grit from my hands. Time stopped. The room was so still I could hear voices arguing in the kitchen. Heavy footsteps on the floor above. The crackle of fire eating wood. Horses approaching on the camp road. I recognized her right away, of course. Bellingham reached for the last potato. The tines of his fork screeched wickedly across the plate. She tried to help us nab Lockton and his foul nest of traitors, remember? No, 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 no. The candlelight caught the rage in her eyes, reflected off the scar on her cheek. 'Twas Isabel. Part 3. Chapter 37. Saturday, February 14th, 1778. Isabel studied me, and I her. She'd grown tall and didn't much look like a girl anymore. She wore a blue checked short gown over top of a homespun chemise and a grimy apron atop her black skirt. She wore the shoes on her feet that she'd worn when we escaped New York, much scuffed now. A length of brown fabric was loosely wrapped below her chin, hiding her neck and covering her shoulders. A kerchief of the same color covered her hair. Bellingham looked at me, then at Isabel, then back to me. Do you not remember her? How much has she told him? If I pretended not to know her, he'd be suspicious. If I admitted the truth, I might expose any lies that she had been forced to spin. I touched the swollen knot on my head. My mind is still clouded, sir. She was Lockton's girl, Bellingham said. Lived on Wall Street. He stood up. Mayhaps that guard hit you harder than I thought. Now I recollect, I said. She's much grown. True enough. The din of stomping boots and loud voices in the front hall drew his attention. Blast! Bellingham began gathering up the papers in front of him. Quick, Curzon, close up all the books with red leather bindings and stack them in the center of the table. Isabel, to the kitchen for wine. The wagon should be ready for you, but prepare the tray first. Isabel paused at the door that led to the kitchen and looked back at me. I could not tell what she made of any of this. Hurry, ordered Bellingham. As she slipped out, 2 gentlemen entered from the hall, brushing snow from their wigs. They were congressmen, but I didn't know their names. You've returned early, Bellingham feigned delight with a false smile. The younger fellow shivered once. A rider came from Albany with news. News about the scheme to unseat General Washington. Disrupted all of the business of the day. Total riot, of course. The older man dropped into a chair with a groan and wiped his nose on a handkerchief. Is this your boy? He looks a bit worse for the wear. There was a misunderstanding after the trial, Bellingham said. The younger gentleman pointed to the papers in Bellingham's hands. Did you complete your study of the reports? Bellingham set the papers down and straightened the cuffs of his shirt. I'd seen him do it countless times, always when he was about to shade the truth in his favor. I want to go over the numbers again. The situation could be much worse than anyone imagined. He plucked a paper from the center of the table. These are the reports from Chester County. The gentleman with the damp nose held up his hands. Not yet, James, please. Some food first. Agreed. The younger congressman sat next to him. Your boy won't serve table dressed like that, will he? I should say not, Bellingham said. He has an appointment with soap and clean clothes right now. You can go, Curzon, he said to me. I took 3 steps away from the table before he stopped me. One moment, he called. Have you forgotten how to take proper leave of your master? That word, master, was a musket ball ripping through my guts. I almost bolted for the fireplace and grabbed that poker so I could brain him. They'd catch me, beat me, maybe kill me, but it would have been worth it. Except for Isabel. All 3 men stared at me, waiting. I stiffened my back, held my arms tight to my sides, and bowed low, silently cursing every man in the room. Thank you, sir, I said, as I stood again straight. Will that be all? Chapter 38, Saturday, February 14th, 1778. I passed Gideon in the hall. He was carrying a tray of wine glasses and a bottle to the newly arrived gentleman. Pardon me, I started. Do you know... He walked past me without a word. The kitchen was crowded with so many tables, chairs, crates, and kegs that there was hardly room to turn around. The walls were filled with shelf after shelf of fat ceramic jars, green glass bottles, boxes for cutlery and spices, crockery plates, and wooden bowls. Extra chairs hung from hooks in the beams where wall met ceiling. 4 pots bubbled over the flames of the hearth, and the lid covering the massive pan peeked out from the hearth hot glowing coals. Most curious of all was the bird sitting inside a cage on the table closest to the fire. It was the size of a small crow, but wore brilliantly colored yellow, green, and blue feathers, and was possessed of a ferocious beak it was using to open a walnut. An old white woman came out from the pantry carrying a smoked ham. I bowed hastily. Good day, ma'am. Can you tell me where I can find Isabel, Mr. Bellingham's maid? That one? She heaved the ham onto the board and limped to the other side of the room. What do you want her for? I stammered. To become better acquainted with my duties. Here. The woman grunted, pulled a stool over the shelves, and climbed up onto it, her limbs shaking. I rushed over before she fell. May I please help, ma'am? She studied me, her blue eyes clouded with age. I need that knife box up there. Of course. She put out a hand so I could help her safely find the ground and watched as I took down the box and set it by the ham. That Isabel, she took a large knife from the box. The wagon just took her back to headquarters. They needed a maid to help with something. She sliced off a bit of ham and tossed it in the cage. The bird snatched the meat in his beak, then gave a low whistle. Cheeky devil, she said to the creature. Mr. Bellingham hired her out? Hires her out every chance he gets. This camp has too many gentlefolk and not enough servants. Pull down a plate for me, will you? And a bowl? She piled ham slices on the plate I handed her, then gave it back to me. Eat. A toothless smile softened her direct manner of speech. She did not have to say it twice. I sat, grabbed a fork, speared a slice of the meat, and stuffed it into my mouth. The taste was indescribable, but better than that was the satisfying sensation of swallowing, and then the luxury of another and another and another piece waiting on my plate. I imagine you'll be hired out too, she said, after you've had a bath. Are you useful at all? Do you have a trade? The artisans are desperate, I hear, especially the gunsmiths. She filled the bowl with soup from a pot hanging over the fire and set it next to my plate. Could the key to our escape be so easy? Wait until we were hired out to the same house, and then run? When will Isabel return? I asked. She continued slicing and chuckled. Lads find love in the strangest places. No, ma'am, I said, my face suddenly hot. It's just... Don't you worry none. She reached across the table and patted the back of my hand. I raised 8 sons and a score of grandsons. Know a few things about lads, I do. Your secret's safe with me. My mouth opened, but for the life of me, I could not think of a lie. The colorful bird gave a tremendous squawk, as if laughing at my discomfort. Shush now, Mrs. Cook tossed more ham in the cage. Keep up that noise and I'll bake you in a pie, I swear. I seized upon the interruption to direct the old lady's attention away from Isabel. If I may, ma'am, what manner of a bird is that? My son William claims it's a parrot. Won it in a card game he did. Says I ought call it King George so we can order it about when the war is over. She gave the soup over the fire astir. William's a fine card player, Lord forgive him. Have you heard of him? William Farnsworth, cook of the 5th Pennsylvania Regiment. Blasted fool's too old to be in the army, but he won't listen to his mother. Or his wife. I wiped my mouth. Are there many parrots in Pennsylvania? She laughed at that. Goodness, no. The sailor who lost the card game came across it in some heathenish place. She limped back to the table and picked up her knife again. Ought to be grateful. Imagine if my William had won himself an elephant. Where would I fit a creature like that in my kitchen? Chapter 39. Sunday, February 15th to Wednesday, February 18th, 1778. Isabel was a puzzlement in the days that followed. When our paths crossed, she would not look at me. I'd say, hello, country, or good day, Isabel, but she acted deaf. At first I thought she was being sensible, that there were dangers for us both if we talked freely in front of others. The kitchen always overflowed with people. Mrs. Cook, Gideon, the Moore family, who owned this house and were reduced to living in one bed chamber, plus any number of messengers and junior officers coming from or heading to the camp. I told myself she was just waiting for the right moment. By the 3rd day, however, I began to worry that she'd suffered a brain fever. We'd passed each other in the hall without another person in earshot, and still she ignored my greeting. I followed her back into the kitchen that time, intent on forcing a conversation, but Gideon was waiting for her, holding the tall rack of bells that he pulled out when readying the wagon to take Isabel for another day of hired-out work. I beg your pardon, miss, I said with care, for Gideon stared openly at us. Do you suffer from an affliction of the ears? Isabel tied on a bonnet, pulled on a red cloak and knitted mittens, then walked out the door without answering me. Gideon smirked and gave a little laugh that made me want to punch his face. Gideon only spoke to me when he was complaining about my work or giving me a new task to do. Though we ate most meals together, worked side by side, and slept on the floor of the bake-oven shed, he never conversated with me like a normal fellow. In the daytime, he ignored my questions. At night, he'd lay himself down and go straight to sleep, or at least pretend to. A peculiar egg, Mrs. Cook called him. Gideon's master, the congressman in York who had loaned him to the committee, was one of the richest men in the South, according to the old woman. He owned 400 slaves who worked the fields of rice and tobacco. Gideon was trusted as General Washington's manservant, Billy Lee, but was said to be twice as clever. He speaks the French and the Italian, Mrs. Cook gossiped. Learned it when he went over the seas with his master. I did not think this was much of an accomplishment, and heartily wished that his master would recall him to York, or send him to Italy, anything to keep his sneering face away from me and Isabel. Gideon treated me like a useless piece of furniture, but when it came to Isabel, he was all false kindness and flattery. Because she was so young and unfamiliar with the world, she encouraged his attentions. These circumstances gave me even more urgency to my plans of escape. I pondered how we could run away day and night, when to run, where to run, how to avoid recapture. Spring was the most likely time, after the snow had melted, but before the army marched into battle. We ought wait for a confusion-filled day so we could be miles away before our absence was noted. But waiting brought danger, too. Bellingham and the congressman would soon return to York, where our chances would be dimmer. He could decide to sell one or both of us because he was short of coin. My doubts and convictions fought back and forth. Run now. Wait for the right moment. Run while we still can. Wait to gather information and strength. But when the gentlemen discussed the birthday ball being thrown for His Excellency General George Washington, the decision was made for me. I did not sleep the night I heard the news. Gideon snored like a well-fed hog, and the sound of it made me heartily miss all the fellows in my hut. It also helped me keep awake as I waited for Isabel to come outside to use the privy. I prayed she did not have a chamber pot. The hinges of the kitchen door squeaked just before the sun rose. I peered out the shed door just in time to see her enter the privy. 'Twas a cold morning. She did not tarry long. I stood at the kitchen door and put a finger to my lips when she returned, then followed her inside. Isabel walked to the hearth and poked at the fire. "Say your piece," she said bluntly. "Pardon me?" She stuck a twist of paper into the flames. "You've been itching to holler at me since you got here. I'll keep working while you bluster on. Mrs. Cook likes everything to be ready when she comes downstairs." She lit 2 candles with the burning twist and tossed it into the fireplace. "Just don't expect me to apologize." "I'm not going to bluster or holler, and I don't want an apology." "I don't have time for lies or foolishness," she said. "Would you please be quiet for one moment?" I walked over to her and whispered, "I can get us out of here."